If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of stuff. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. Fortunately, that's not my story. That's the opening line to Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. But the opening line has a way of kind of setting the tone, doesn't it? It was a pretty heavy tone. It was the best of times. It was worst of times. Today we have a new opening line. We're going to be looking at the first several chapters of the book of Daniel. Daniel's book very well could have opened like the Catcher in the Rye. But there's a different hand governing the story. In Daniel chapter 1, verses 1, we read this. Thank you. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. In the year 605 BC, nearly 800 years after conquering the land of Palestine, the Promised Land, God's people were taking the last gasps of their nation's life. It started off so well. When entering the Promised Land, a covenant was made between Israel and God on Mount Sinai. It became known as the Sinai or the Mosaic Covenant. Israel would have been established as a distinct people, as a nation existing under God's own theocratic rule. God promised Israel that they would be his special possession, or a holy nation. And the Lord promised to be their God. He promised they would receive protection from him, from things like plague or pillaging or famine, as long as they remained in a right relationship with him. But this promise was conditional on Israel's obedience to the law that they were given through Moses. The temporal blessings he promised them would be theirs, but only if they kept his commandments. And failure to keep God's commandments would result not only in the removal of his blessing, but also a set of curses or consequences. And God would divorce or annul his covenant with them, and they would no longer be under his special protection and provision. Our story picks up at the end of an era. A little over 100 years before our story, the whole top half of the northern tribes of Israel were ripped away and lost to history. The Assyrian army came in by God's direction and took them. Now, the southern half of Palestine, which was called by the tribe of Judah, the people who had done a bit better job of keeping God's ways, they weren't doing it so well anymore, though. And God was beginning to call down the curses as their unfaithfulness demanded. The people of Judah thought, wrongly, that God wouldn't let his temple be taken. He would protect his people because guarded behind the walls of Jerusalem was the Temple of Solomon, and in it, the Ark of the Covenant. The temple would have been one of the great wonders of the world at its time. They had kind of forgotten that God was pretty content to dwell in tents. They had forgotten that the covenant relationship was always more important to him than anything that symbolized that relationship, even the temple. The southern nation of Judah was drawing its final breaths, whether they realized it or not. And our story opens as Judah is falling. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem to besiege it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. The deliverance that Judah expected never came. God, instead of defending his temple and its treasures, gave it to a foreign people who put it in the service of a foreign god, and allowed the treasures of the temple to be robbed and placed. A bit about how people trust God was tied to their perception of physical objects. People thought, even in Moses' time, they began to worship the post, or the bronze statue of the serpent. And Jews at this time would have, and were, as seen through other prophets, relying simply on the physical presence of the temple to guard their relationship with God, rather than their relationship with God guarding the temple. The gold, though, was not the only treasure in Jerusalem that the king had intended and took. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Nebuchadnezzar also took the best and brightest people, as well as many of the royal family. One of the early signs of the downfall of a nation is when its scientists, its artists, its political and spiritual leadership is lost. Whether that's people leaving on their own or being deported or being killed or carried away. When the movers and shakers, when the leaders and the skilled craftsmen are gone, that's a giant red warning flag for the people group. The Assyrians that conquered the northern half of Palestine were known for their utter destruction and brutality. They were a wretched people, and all the nations around them loathed them for their cruelty. The northern tribes were given into their hand by God, but then God would punish the Assyrians for their cruelty. God gave the Assyrians to the Babylonians, or here known as the Chaldeans, which is just a geographical region that the people are from. But Babylon took a different approach and was more accommodating to several of the nations that they took control over, as long as they would submit to their rule. When they came for Judah, they actually came in about 3 stages of conquest. The first was in 605, followed by a few years later in 597, and then finally in 587. The first wave is sort of what we're seeing here with Daniel being taken away. Later, the kings that Babylon put in place to sort of rule as their proxy would rebel against them. And by the third time, the temple was burned to the ground. All the people that were still living were either killed or deported. A few fled, and then just the poorest people were left behind to tend for vineyards and keep the land from getting overgrown. The people, the region, the consequences to whole of Jerusalem was decimation. But for our context here, it's still about the first wave. The king took some of the best and brightest from Jerusalem, and our text tells us a couple things about them. When people migrate to another country, into another culture, one of the barriers to integration is language. If you're not able to speak the language of a host country, it's very difficult for two peoples to become one people. The point of the Tower of Babel to divide people was done through confusing speech and languages. Uniting that language is essential. Another is the food custom being pressed upon these people. Eating and its cultural significance it's pretty big everywhere you go. A lot of cultural customs and expectations can be built around eating and sharing meals together. Knowing how to be polite can take time when you don't really know the rules of the meal. I may have told you this before. When I traveled to India a few years back, being raised, it was polite to finish your plate. You ate what you took, and you took what you intended to eat. In India, the custom is more geared towards being a good host. And if your guest has an empty plate, then you haven't provided enough food for them. So you give them more, and you insist on it because you don't want to seem like an ungenerous host. I was so full. It was ridiculous. I would finish the plate, and then they would insist on filling it. And back, because I was trying to be polite and not refuse their food, and they were trying to... I just needed to leave like a spoonful of food on the plate, and I'd have been good. But I know that now. And so do you. So, word to the wise. But food customs are actually one of the things that God wrote into his Mosaic covenant in order to keep the peoples different, to keep them separate. This is something we're going to see as we run into later down in our text. But Nebuchadnezzar, he was generally an accommodating and welcoming to foreign people that he conquered relative to the time he was in. He wanted to integrate and assimilate people into the Babylonian culture. And by and large, it was a fairly successful endeavor for its time. Babylon became one of the largest and most successful nations in the history of humanity, partly by the way that it assimilated and accommodated the regions that it conquered. 3 years, also, is the time that was given. It's a reasonable amount of time to adjust to a new way of life. You might recognize 3 years from Jesus' time, too. Jesus discipled his followers for 3 years. But among those captives, those promising young people that came to enrich and build the kingdom of Babylon, are 4 young men that are mentioned in our text. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Daniel, you know, he's sitting in the front row. But you also know because it's the cover on the book that we're reading. The other 3 names you may know from their Babylonian names, or the names that they were given by their captors. We see those coming up next. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Now, a little bit of fun. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah, the Hebrew name, means Yahweh is gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. Sort of like there's no other God like God, like Yahweh. And Azariah is Yahweh has helped or will help. One of the two, depending. But these are all probably fairly common names in Israel at the time. And in this context, they're listed in alphabetical order from the Hebrew. And this is common as you read Scripture too, as far as changing of names. They were given new names to more rapidly assimilate them into the new culture. You see this with people like Joseph and Esther, even New Testament people like Peter and Saul. Both had Hebrew names and names for the cultures that they lived in. And these youths, likely, they had no choice in the matter. Which you feel a little bit more when you understand what the Babylonian names mean. Belshazzar, which appears to mean something like Bel save his life, Bel being a reference to one of the Babylonian gods. Hananiah, changed to Shadrach, probably means something like command of Aku, the moon god. Mishael or Meshach. Mishael was who is what God is, or Yahweh. Meshach is who is what Aku is. Same idea, but the God was changed out. Azariah into Abednego probably means something like servant of Nebo, which would have been the second greatest god in the Babylonian pantheon. You might not remember all of that. I would understand. But one thing you can remember is that each of their former names was a reference to Yahweh, the true God, and all of their new names were changed as references to the new pagan deities. It's difficult to really understand, let alone describe, how earth-shattering this would have been to the Israelites. I don't think many of us can really wrap our mind around what it would look like to have our entire nation conquered and our people led off to be assimilated into a foreign land. The political and military part would also only be one angle of this. America and all the other countries are just political institutions at their base, and no political institution has a covenant relationship with God like Israel did. God has not made a contract with any other living country. He's not promised the same blessings and curses for any other nations today. Our view of God and our view of various nations, they're kind of related, but they're not at all related like Israel was with God. God had taken Israel as his chosen people, as a holy nation. And now God was kind of divorcing them. The Israelites had played the harlot long enough, and God had forgiven them time and time again. But now the separation was taking place, the divorce. The Mosaic covenant also included curses for breaking the covenant, and now God was following through. Their whole way of life was about to be undone. There was no going back to the way things were. And of those who didn't die in the siege, nearly all of them would die in a foreign land under the rule of a pagan society. God would keep his covenants to Abraham and to David, and to a very small selection of people that would return to Israel. But for the vast majority of everybody living in Judah, they would either die or remain and disappear in exile. The people would be led or dragged into an unfamiliar country with an unfamiliar culture, speaking an unfamiliar language, that worshipped a pantheon of false gods, broke most, if not all, of God's laws, and celebrated those that did. Their whole way of life was lost in about the blink of an eye. And perhaps worst of all, it was God that was doing this. It was his hand directing the destruction of Jerusalem. It was his intention that the temple was decimated and ransacked, and its treasures spread to the four winds. And by all accounts, this is the time period when the Ark of the Covenant, the object more precious to Israel than anything, the symbolic mercy seat of God and presence, it was taken, never to be returned or found. Unless you've seen Indiana Jones, then maybe it's in a casket somewhere in a warehouse. But this point is where our story picks up. It's not a very fun place to jump into Israel's story. In fact, it's probably one of the most painful parts of Israel's story. And for our four young men, they were just dropped right in at the end of a very long and painful decline. It's not their fault Judah was falling. They inherited the consequences from generations of misbehavior of their parents and grandparents and the rest of their nation. Daniel and his companions would likely never see Palestine for the rest of their lives. They may never see their families again. And the temple would be burned to the ground behind them. The place God communed with Israel was gone. And at this point, there must have been a real temptation to think that all was lost. Their country, their homes, their covenant. But you and I know Israel's story is far, far from over. And that this chapter in the story is not the last. But if you were part of the people being led out of Jerusalem as it burned down behind you, it would have probably looked and felt very different, because you would have no idea what was coming next. But God does. And God's story wasn't done. And God was still writing his story. And he never set down the pen. Even though his people would never be the same, God's purposes were. His promises to Abraham, to David, they were still to be fulfilled. And even though God's temple was in ashes, God was never too much attached to wood and stone, to cloth or gold. Those symbols, important as they may have been for a time, were just symbols for the relationship that he wanted with his creation. But God gave those symbols to help us remember, not because they help him in any way. God was just as much God in Babylon as he was in Jerusalem. And Israel had forgotten that. They had thought and relied on the symbols of their relationship to substitute for an actual relationship. And when they did that, their relationship broke. They no longer worshiped and served God. They served the temple and its objects. But Daniel and his friends, they're too young to receive any blame for any of this. But that's the lives they were handed by their forefathers. There's only a handful of places that you can go in history and drop someone where they'll live and die without much turmoil or changing times. And you and I, we don't get to choose where we've been dropped into history. One thing we can learn from these opening verses in the book of Daniel is that wherever we find ourselves in history, even during the hardest parts, we are still, in fact, in his story. We are still under the sovereign guiding hand of God. Why are things the way they are now? That can actually be a much harder question to answer than it seems at first. Scripture points to a number of reasons why hard times come. Sometimes it's because we live in a fallen world. Sometimes it's the actions of evil done by men and women. Sometimes it's God's own direction. But if you find yourself in hard times, whatever the reason for it, it's not the last chapter. God has not finished writing his story. And you might just be a part in a much bigger, much better story whose ending just hasn't been written quite yet. There are many troubling things in our lives, things that feel outside of our control, because they are. Wars going on, uncontained diseases, natural and man-made disasters causing significant losses. There's so many things in life that you and I have absolutely no control over. And it's precisely when we are in those times that we must remember to turn to God, to trust and rely on him. God's sovereignty over his creation has never faltered or failed. He's got no blind spots. His wisdom is so much higher than our little minds can begin to comprehend. What was Daniel's role in the broader story of Israel? He had no idea. I said earlier that there is no nation in the world whose God is the Lord, a nation who God has promised a covenant to, like Israel. And that's true, but I did leave out one important caveat. God actually does still have a covenant relationship with the people group. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we read, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." We don't get to pick what part of history we're born into, but God did. And he placed us in the time in which we are now. Why? I really couldn't tell you. But I can tell you he's not done writing the story. Sometimes we can be placed into difficult circumstances. They're outside of our control. But wherever we are placed, we can trust that God's hand is still writing. A story that will make much more sense when the final chapters are written. When the themes and turns of the story finally connect and his wisdom and his goodness are on full display. As we follow the story of Daniel, it's not a straight path. There's ups and downs and there's unseen turns. But behind it all, God's sovereign hand is faithful. The church is the recipient of a new and even better covenant. And God has always been faithful to his covenants. And we've got the best one so far. No matter what chapter your life looks like, no matter what part of the story you feel dropped into, God can turn some of the hardest and most difficult eras of history back into his story. And just like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, if we stay faithful to God and continue to trust him and trust his promises, we can be guaranteed a part of his redeeming work in the time in which we now live, even if we don't get to see how it all works out just yet. Even when things feel like they're out of control, especially when they feel like they're out of control, we can remember that they are never out of his. He is still writing history, and our part in this chapter depends on our relationship with him and with nothing else. Pray with me.